Mike lived in a world where there was earth-shattering events, prophetic words, new relationships, this connection, that connection, and it was always at a level 10. There were 3 or 4 of those every couple months. And then Dr. Brown and what he did not help that vice. It created more divisiveness between us. Because Mike would use those stories to keep you hooked into, if I leave here, I will miss out. Back to Dr. Brown. What I didn't know, it took several weeks to find this out, but he was a friend of Eric Volz.
Welcome to the Minor Prophets podcast. I'm your co-host, Jeff Simons, and I also have with me co-host JonMark Baker. JonMark, how you doing?
Man, I am doing swell as a bell, feeling fine as frog's hair. All of the weird idioms from the South that I can think of right now, I'm doing all of them right now.
Frog's hair. I don't even know that one. Never heard it before. It's 40 degrees, so it's Texas freezing here. So I'm like in a vest and long sleeve, and I don't think that compares to where you
in Detroit,
are.
Man, we're in shorts at 40 degrees. It's beach weather, bro.
Beach weather in Detroit. Got it. a lot of beachfront property.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot in Michigan. You got to drive outside of Detroit a little bit to get there.
Well, for those that are new to the podcast, I'm Jeff Simons. I lead Kingdom Awakening International. It is a missions-based ministry, and I'm also involved in local house churches here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And we have JonMark Baker. JonMark is a pastor and leader in the Roots Church Network in Detroit, and a pastor and a speaker and an author and almighty anointed prophet of Most High.
Yeah, it's a really long business card, but barely fits in my wallet. But yeah, all those things.
Well, and we're excited to bring you this episode today. Today we have with us Wes Martin, pastor of Grace Church in St. Louis, and formerly of IHOP and a member of the Advocate Group. Wes, thanks for joining us.
Hey, man, I'm excited to be with you guys, man. Hear your stories, who you are, and then have a good old frank conversation with where we're at in the church and what in the world is happening in the last so many months.
You know, it kind of feels like an episode of Jerry Springer.
Unfortunately, yes.
It's where there's just drama everywhere. There's shouting. Everybody's, chanting something.
All the fighting,
it's a little bit of a
right
mess
out there for everybody to see, and embarrassment. Yeah, man. It's been tough.
But you know that I am still fully convinced, even though this is a challenging season for the body, that it's a good thing.
100%.
These are things that have been behind the scenes, that have been hindering us, that have been hurting people, and it needed to come to the light.
100%.
And it really, a lot of it started, you could say it started back with Ravi Zacharias, but I'd say that was, a little bit further back. But I would say that what we're seeing now with so many different people coming forward and sharing their stories of negative experiences that they've had within really charismatic ministries. A lot of it started with what happened at IHOP. And you were one of the members of the Advocate Group and boldly stood and
the Complaint Group is what I heard it was.
Yeah, that was the first title we were given, with the Complaint Group, by our dear friend Stuart Greaves. I think that was, I don't know if he did it or not, but somebody there decided that was a good name for us. And we were like, what the heck, man? The Complaint Group? What happened to 20 years of friendship? But anyways.
The whining group. I mean,
no, that one rubbed wrong a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, when we read that in the newspaper.
Oh, I bet. I mean, it could have been worse. It could have been the gossip group.
Yeah.
Trying to shut it down even further. But recently, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen, unfortunately, Michael Brown has been in the news for his own situation, and he was involved very early in the allegations with Mike Bickle and IHOP. So what was your experience with Dr. Michael Brown in that process?
Yeah, I mean, several of us, we've had, I don't know what, decade plus relationship with Dr. Brown. And so he was a mutual friend, or at least a mutual, leader that we were all very aware of and history with and knew personally. Dr. Brown, when he first showed up, um, he called me, we talked on the phone, not just with me, but with several of us that were in the advocate group. And just for clarity, the advocate group title, we're friends. We never had a group name. People are always kind of like, so you're a part of the advocate group. And I'm like, well, no, I'm actually a part of a 20-year friendship of people standing together to bring accountability to Mike. And yeah, we were somehow through all that, we got named at this advocacy group. And then it was 100 people, 200 people, or 4 people. And I'm like, I don't know even who is defined as. Anyways, that's just a little side note because there's so much speculation about who is that group. But back to Dr. Brown. It was interesting because here we were in the thick of things, and he shows up, and what I didn't know, it took several weeks to find this out, but he was a friend of Eric Volz. And so he had been talking with Eric behind the scenes and just getting daily updates and briefings from Eric. And so he there was a bit of him positioning himself, in my opinion, that he had an inside take on things that we didn't have. And that wasn't helpful. He was interjecting into a situation where, again, with Dwayne and myself and Brian and Alan and Jono, we had all worked there. We had been a part of this ministry and Mike's life for 20 plus years. We had a lot of history with the ELT, the executive leadership team at the time, 20 years of friendship. We have been interacting with them. So it was a little awkward, when Dr. Brown inserted himself. It was awkward and hard because of, he kind of had an approach of not a know-it-all, but this is, a very strong opinion that he had on things. And we disagreed with his opinion pretty strongly, pretty boldly. So it was hard.
He went on even as late as, I mean, it was, I don't know if he still has this opinion that the original investigation was a true third-party investigation. And he went on his radio program saying that.
No, I mean, I don't know if it was ever public, but he had plenty of times where he was telling them, not just us, that he did disagree with them getting just a random law firm compared to a Guidepost or a Grace type of investigative approach. He was pushing for Guidepost and Grace very strongly and disagreeing with them for hiring, I think it was Lathrop or whoever the name of the law firm was at the end of. They went through 2 or 3 there in the early days. He was
it was the one that actually did the sort of partial investigation that really prompted Tammy Woods to come forward.
Right.
I heard him on his program say that was a third-party investigation.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because he's, now in his own situation, and his board, initially went and hired this, law firm, just, a typical law firm compared to a Grace, Guidepost, etc. Now, since then, they have done pretty much the same steps that IHOP has done. They've moved away from that and are now, actively seeking to engage someone like a Guidepost or Grace or Firefly, people like that. So that's interesting, just the way all that kind of shook out.
So your experience was his involvement kind of hindered the process?
I mean, I don't think it helped. I don't know about hindering. I think the only thing that it hindered was probably his involvement didn't help personal relationships, for sure. It if anything, it wedged a And I don't think he did this intentionally. I don't think he did any of it intentionally. I think unintentionally he just created more of a wedge between us and the ELT. I think Eric Volz did the most. Eric Volz did the biggest wedging, if you will, between us and we're talking, Sliker, Stewart, Isaac, Lenny, Marcy. These are people that we've done life with for 20 plus years. And
Right.
so all of a sudden the wedge between us, in my opinion, Eric was the primary person. Of course, Bickle was a huge person, but Eric and then Dr. Brown and what he did not help that vice. It created more divisiveness between us.
Who do you think suggested Eric Volz or brought Eric Volz? You said he was friends with Dr. Brown.
Yeah, Dr. Brown knew him for several years. Stewart knew him. Mike knew him. Mike was, in those early days, no decisions were made outside of Mike. And so every person brought in my opinion, down to Dr. Brown, was at the direction, in my opinion, I don't know this for a fact, but in my opinion, with Bickle, or at least Bickle approving it. It could have been Stewart's idea, but Bickle approved it. Sam would have been the only one because Sam didn't get invited. Sam showed up. Now Francis was invited by Stewart, and so I think when Francis came in, and him and Sam, what they didn't know is that Sam and Francis had already been talking to several of the victims and us extensively. I think if now Bickle ended up finding that out, and that's why he turned them away when they showed up at his house. But he didn't know that initially. And so, yeah. But Dr. Brown, I would think it was probably either Mike's idea or Stewart's idea. And there was always a reason. There was always a reason. Mike he's a master manipulator, man. He's a master at doing everything. So Eric Volz, Eric knew there was stuff in the air as early as May, and that was out of his own admission. He admitted that in one of his, interviews that he did with somebody. So he knew there was things in the air, and I assume, I guarantee Mike knew that. And so, yeah. And Eric believed that everything was mostly exaggerated. Even to this day, I would think that Eric would believe that Mike did some things wrong, but it was mostly exaggerated. He's mostly should be exonerated. I believe he believes that 110%. And that those are all my opinions, of course.
So he said something as early as May.
Yes.
May is when the big push of prayer and fasting for Israel happened.
Yeah.
Do you think that was manufactured?
I don't. If it was manufactured, there were 10 other reasons why it was being manufactured. I don't think this was the sole reason.
Well, because of the dark horse prophecy, right? When we go to the east, then the dark horse of accusation.
And some of those things, I think, could have just happened and been convenient for him. Meaning, I don't know if he knew that Jane Doe was going to start talking the way she did. I mean, he knew she was talking. I don't think he knew she was going to go all the way talking. I think he was doing everything in his power to still contain it. And he didn't know other people were talking. And so I think he was, looking back now, I think through the years, Mike had all kinds of other people beginning to talk. So you have all these fires that you're trying to contain, right? I think through the years, it wouldn't surprise me at all if every big IHOP prophetic story swirl was around the fire beginning to heat up a little bit. And when I say fire, a negative, scandalous fire. And he would create a distraction. And so was some of that in May, because he was talking as early as January and February, the whole Israel 21-day fast thing, he was beginning to stir that up in January, February. But there were other fires that were being stoked in January, February as well. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if he, played into that as a big distraction in Israel, because one of the big lines that they were using against us, still to this day, is, don't you care for Israel? I mean, I think in one of Eric's interviews, he still had the audacity to even connect the dots of October 7th and this all happening. And then, of course, he would say, no, I'm just saying, isn't that a coincidence? He just said this on the Eric Metaxas show not too long ago. And I'm thinking that disgusts me. That is so perverted at a mindset level, but he's drank the Kool-Aid. You spend time with Bickle like he did, you think, because I would want to say this to Eric, Eric, you think you can control narratives? You have no idea until you've spent time with Bickle. And Bickle spun him like a top. And, proof's in the pudding. I mean, he's still to this day pushing the narrative that Bickle is guilty, but it's big time exaggerated. And I believe he believes that. And what pains me is that I know he's, spilling that in his circles of influence. That pains me, because we have several mutual friends.
Well, so the investigation is still happening, and once that comes, the results of that come out, you mentioned that your hope would be that the body would say, okay, we're responding to this investigation and we agree with these findings. We're not going to platform somebody in this particular way. It sounds like what you're hoping for is similar to how Jack Deere, Mike Bickle, Rick Joyner, how they approached Paul Cain way back when, right? There was the investigation, and then there was a lack of repentance or going through any kind of restoration. So they essentially said, they had the public signing off saying, we do not approve of Paul Cain's ministry because we believe he's a danger. Yeah. It sounds like that's the expectation or hope from this investigation, is that the body would recognize it as a authoritative or giving glimpse into what's really been happening, and that they would respond and not try to give a microphone to somebody that could be dangerous or that is dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, I think just the truth. I think that Mike, in a small swirl, not at large, but in a small way that's still significant for that world anyway, he's been spinning like crazy, spinning this. And so I'm hoping that, like Eric Volz, Eric Volz goes on the Eric Metaxas show just a few weeks ago. And with a large audience, and they bring it up at the very, very end. And just the little bit that he did, it sows so much dismissiveness into it. And so, yeah, I'm hopeful that a statement that is coming from such, qualified, credible people like Tikkun, that has no, especially if they're going to use the Israel thing as their little, some kind of leaf of upper hand of whatever, to have Tikkun come in and champion the investigation. I'm hopeful that this statement brings clarity to where statements like what Eric did on the Eric Metaxas show can be rebuffed, can be challenged,
right?
With the hey, that might be what you say, but you did read that, not just the final report, but how this group of leaders and pastors and leaders in the body of Christ, made up of all kinds of different people, their statement on the report. You did see that, right? And so that's what I'm hopeful for, that it brings clarity and necessary judgment. Yes. That'll go beyond Mike, by the way. It won't just be Mike. Right. It'll be beyond Mike.
Yep. Especially as we see these other investigations opening and things happening with them. Absolutely.
Right.
Well, I want to ask a little bit of a generalized question then.
Sure.
If looking back on how things happened, are there things that you've learned about eldership and leadership within church structure and ministry structure that you think should be applied or that you're applying it at Grace, or that should be applied in other ministries that could help prevent some of the confusion and bring clarity and transparency to ministries?
There's all kinds of models out there. I don't have an opinion on models, because every model is going to have their flaw. However, the kind of person that you put on a board or on an elder team, if that person does not have the guts, the backbone to confront you, Amanda and I, my wife, we just had this conversation a couple of days ago. I'm thinking of people like Elizabeth Herder. I'm thinking of people like Joel Richardson. I have another good friend who's a pastor and leads an outfitter in Colorado. His name is Justin Fry. These are guys, they're close with me. Like, I would consider them friends, but they're also people that if I was, spinning and doing everything I could to not be held accountable, they're the kind of people that are going to call me to the carpet no matter our relationship. That's the kind of people you have to have if you're really putting things in place for the purpose of accountability, which that I think should be one of the reasons, right? You got to have people there then that have the backbone to hold people accountable, especially when there's, a relationship there that's been longstanding. Because if you just get yes men or yes women in these roles, I think it defeats the purpose. They're not going to do anything. They're just buddies, and they're going to believe whatever you say.
What's the distinction then between, so I have quite a bit of experience being on teams and boards and, pastoring, you have that. There is a distinction between somebody who is just divisive and troublesome and just wants to fight about everything.
You don't want that person either.
Yeah. Versus somebody who's truly trying to bring clarity. So, I guess, do you have any insight on telling the difference between those types of people? Or
I think I wish I did. I think everybody would, usually it's the person empowered in the role, and then, however long later, realizing this is a disaster. I think what we should learn then is putting people in those roles should be a very slow process, and making sure that they're qualified in all kinds of various areas, whether it be, of course, character, maturity, wisdom, smarts, all kinds of things. And longevity of loyalty to the ministry. I think I would just say slow of putting somebody in that position compared to being quick. That's my only take. And it's still not going to be a perfect science. There's still going to be, because people that are like that, and then they're in that role over the course of time, life happens. Your mind changes a little bit. You get a little bit of, in the flesh more and more and more throughout the years, whatever. And what maybe was a perfect candidate 5 years ago, now all of a sudden is a disaster. I don't think there's a perfect science, but I do think there are some things that we could do to, make it better, best we can.
Well, and you're still, what I just heard is still evaluating, recognizing where people are at. And, it's one is people change. Sometimes they're in a good season when they start, and then over time they, like, I'm sure you've seen people end up in the error. I sure have, that started well.
Right.
And even in a perfect system, it doesn't ensure that you don't have issues. It's
that's right.
It's really trying to maximize the effectiveness of the church in responding to situations like this.
Yeah.
Now, this situation that you guys have been facing, it was a little bit, it seemed to me like there was a slowness from, I would just say, the leaders in the body to respond, or they responded in ways that were wildly unhelpful when they responded publicly, rather than showing concern for people that have been wounded. It was, Mike's going to be back in ministry. This is a nothing burger. All those types of unhelpful comments.
Right.
What's your impression or feeling from the leadership in the body, and has your opinion on it changed since you've kind of gone through this experience?
Yeah, incredibly disappointed not just in comments that I thought were just sinful, dismissive, rude, uneducated. Of course, those comments, you just want to slap somebody. But I understood it because they were the good old boys. They were Mike's buddies, and they're going to believe whatever he says, period. And they've had, quote unquote, these decades of relationship. That's something I scrutinize these days. Like, oh, what does that really mean? Decades of relationship. You mean, a couple lunches a year and a hangout in the green room at a conference, a handful of times, like really knowing somebody.
Right.
So I've definitely changed my opinion on that. Even how quickly I would say, oh, I know that person. I'll vouch for their integrity. I've been like, you know what? I got to stop doing that. Unless I really, really know you, or we've done life, like real life together over a long period of time, I'm going to be like, yeah, maybe they did do that. I don't know. And so there was that point. I tell you, I was more perturbed, or just as perturbed, of leaders that were somewhat close to Mike, and they wouldn't say anything. And even still to this day, haven't said anything. And I lost a lot of respect for a lot of leaders not having a backbone or not willing to wade in and say really difficult things for whatever reason. I don't know the reason. I'm sure the reasons are complex. Dwayne was just in town over the weekend, and we were just talking about this. Like, why? Why are pastors and leaders so either don't say anything at all, won't even read anything at all? What is it? Like, is it they just believe that they're all lies? And, I think the conclusion we came down to is an issue of power. Is they're not willing to have any kind of stain or any kind of threat at all of their little worlds, of their little empires, I guess. And I'm not even sure I fully understand what all that is, but I was very disappointed and discouraged with the lack of people willing to speak clearly and boldly when they had proximity to some of the victims, and they had proximity to Mike, and they had proximity to us. They knew us for a long time, and they were shown all the stuff. And then even after the fact, they were beginning to see Mike dismiss and spin and lie, and still wouldn't say anything.
Yeah.
I'm tempted to ask you who you're most disappointed in, but I won't.
Well, I think some over the course of time did. Jack Deere was one that was actually the quickest to speak boldly and clearly. Of course, his son Stephen was very involved at writing and investigating on some of it. Lee Cummings, up in Michigan, Lee was very quick. And I wouldn't even say that Lee has like a nationally recognized name, but he, has a somewhat of a big footprint in some swirls. And so he was willing, to speak clearly and boldly, quickly. And yeah, there were others that took, in my opinion, way too long for whatever reason, and others that have just still to this day not said anything. And I just hope I'm not like that. I want to be somebody that's willing to put my neck on the line, even when it's going to cost me. Man, I just don't want to lose that. And I hope that we can have more and more of that as we move forward.
As somebody who has grown up within this movement, I was born and raised in the Assemblies of God church, but we were always sort of, revival people, and loved the moving of the Spirit. I remember going down to Toronto and Brownsville when I was a kid, and I grew up in this idea of revival and the move of the Spirit, and you know what? God met me within this movement. I got to know Jesus for real. Wow. I experienced his power. I heard his voice, and it began to launch me into what has become now a ministry, but started just as just a real relationship with the Lord. And I remember listening to sermons from people like Mike Bickle and people like, I mean, just fill in the blanks. And, some people that I just wish it has been. I mean, this is the experience of sort of an outsider from, like, you knew these people and had 20-year friendships. I viewed these people as heroes,
Mm.
or, people that, like, when I become a mature man of God, I will look
Yeah.
something like
Right, right,
Mike
right.
Bickle,
Yeah, yeah.
you know,
I mean, I was right
and
there with you, over a year ago, 100%. Yeah, with Mike specifically.
and for me, it's not just Mike Bickle. I guess this is I guess my biggest disappointment. I guess I'm just echoing everything you just said, I guess, but my biggest disappointment is not with Mike specifically, because if it was just Mike and he was dealt with, I would be disappointed in a man.
Mm.
Um, what I am disappointed in is not a man at this
Mhm.
point. What I am disappointed in is an entire system
Yeah,
that has propped up men
yeah,
and and attacked their victims
yeah.
on their behalf,
Right.
not just defended them, attacked their victims, or simultaneously kept completely silent when they knew and still know that there's not just one, not just two. I mean, Bethel had Bob Hartley teach
Mm.
at their School of the Prophets
Mhm.
for multiple years.
Right.
They have, there's this whole kerfuffle. They banned him from the premises, or they unbanned him, and then they banned. I don't know what happened. I'll just say Bethel, for me, I love that ministry.
Yeah.
Um, I respect the people there. I'm very disappointed
Mhm.
that it's like some of the people who portend to be the fathers in this movement have just they're only fathers when it's convenient.
Yeah. I'm with you, man. I'm with you. It is. It's way beyond just one or two guys. It is seemingly a huge issue in the church where, and I wonder sometimes if this is the fruit of, what we call, celebrity Christianity or whatever that is, just where we've allowed a lot of guys that seem to have, it's a tendency of narcissism, and we've allowed them to. I mean, I heard somebody say the other day that, when it comes to pastors and churches, narcissism, the chances of that person being a narcissist is like 3,000% more of a chance. And what in the world? That is, I mean, yeah, that's just, that's insane. But we've created it. We've created this culture so man-centered. And then, of course, it makes sense of why guys are not about to allow any kind of threat to their worlds of criticizing somebody else. They're just going to try to quietly, move out and just move on beyond standing up like a shepherd when a wolf is around and laying the hammer when there's a threat to the flock. What a mess, man. We're in a mess. But God is merciful. He's gracious. And like you said earlier, Jeff, I think, we're going to come out of this and we're going to be so much cleaner and purer and stronger and more Christ-like as the church. I know we are, because I know the Good Shepherd, and that's where he's taken us. So, but man, it's definitely a bit disheartening in the process of seeing what's exposed. I mean,
Right.
Ron and I, Ron is the founding senior pastor here at Grace. I'm the lead pastor. The church has been here for 45 plus years. And, over the years, he's been involved in so many different relationships and movements. And, all this stuff started happening, right? So we've, of course, had a few people leave because they've been like, who in the world are you platforming? You know, the the church-wide book studies that we have done, there's my little thumb thing. We did a book study on The Blessed Life by Robert Morris. We did a book study on Growing in Prayer with Mike Bickle. We've platformed Dr. Brown here for the last many, many years. You know, Chris Reed, we platformed Chris Reed here a couple years ago. I mean, we had one guy that was more from a Reformed background, but he was, very intrigued by the church in so many different ways, because we're not a hyper charismatic church. I would say that we're a very balanced, believe in the gifts of God, but also have a bit of a seeker sensitive culture to us. Our weekend front doors ain't open to everyone. We have incredible worship and preach where everybody can understand. And this guy, he came in with reservations and led here. He led in various ministries here, and they left the church, a year or so ago. And he put on Facebook the other day, and I can't argue with it. I mean, he went through the names of who we've platformed here over the last year. It's embarrassing. And I'm like, good night. To be in the church world right now and to not be embarrassed, and then you're not awake. Especially as a pastor. We have to bear this.
Well, I think one of the things that we're guilty of, it goes with idolizing individuals, is we kind of put them in a generic bucket of, I always trust everything that this person says, or I never trust anything that this person says. And as people are kind of deconstructing and that has various meanings in a bunch of different ways, but as they're evaluating, their own spiritual walk and relationship with the Lord, the confusing part for many is that, like JonMark was saying, is they had legitimate encounters at IHOP. They had legitimate experience. The Lord is the one that led them there. So there's this aspect of God's leading, putting people in a place that isn't entirely safe. And it's, I think part of it is we've been, like you mentioned, where there's big ministries and they don't want to do or say anything that could jeopardize the size of that ministry. And to a certain extent, I have a degree of compassion for those types of ministers, especially if you're a professional minister, you went to school for ministry, you have one skill and it is in ministry, and that is your livelihood. Allowing and creating a space for your own mistakes, or to own your own mistakes, or acknowledge the mistakes that other ministers make. That's a hard thing to do. It's not easy. But it is an essential thing. And we see it walked out biblically, right? You see Paul correcting Peter publicly. And Paul, who has a small little ministry, he can't possibly be thinking, oh, this is going to do such great things for my ministry to do this. But it was the right thing to do, and
the right thing to do.
And I think that I hope the direction that we're getting, I want to kind of put a little bit of hope into this podcast, because a lot of times they can, when you emphasize the things that are going wrong, it can come across in a way that's discouraging. And I don't think it's discouraging. I actually think this is good. And I think what we're going to come out the other side with is a more authentic approach to charismatic, to the ministers, to prophetic words and things like that. So where we start calling balls and strikes, where you don't end up with, I'll just use Chris Reed as an example, who had seemingly an accurate prophetic word about one of Trump's recent appointments a couple of years ago. And at the same time, he clearly mishandled his involvement with the Mike Bickle and IHOP, and rejecting Sam Storms and Francis Chan coming. I would say that his prophetic word about I think a word or a visitation that said that Putin was going to die in office, that Biden was going to die in office, that China was going to invade Taiwan, and that all of these types of things where, hey, you know what, that either one, that was an illegitimate encounter, you made it up, or if it was a prophetic word, you missed the word.
You missed it.
And we one of the things that we don't do, and I don't have a great idea for this, I don't know, maybe you do, JonMark, maybe you do. We don't have a great way that we judge prophecy once it's released nationally. You're starting to see it with Remnant Radio, with Josh and the Michaels. I love what they do with the prophetic word, even though it's not a fun process.
Yeah, no, I do too. I think it's super helpful.
But I've seen the prophetic getting abused in these leadership roles. I mean, we saw it with, maybe you don't call it prophetic, you call it prophetic preaching or whatever, where Mike had the whole the black horse thing that he was
right.
And it's the word of the Lord is being used as an excuse to try to hide misbehaviors. And that's something that I find particularly concerning. And, you look Old Testament, that it didn't turn out well for the people that did that. So what is your current disposition towards, I'd just say, the prophetic movement or how we steward revelation?
Yeah. It's, I think we need healthy skepticism. We have viewed skepticism as a lack of faith or immaturity. I don't know what we viewed it as, not just with prophetic words, but just with people in general. We need healthy skepticism. We need to be critical. There needs to be an increase. I understand too much, and I'm not saying too much. I'm saying if that pendulum is swung where we're not critical enough, that's where I would put a lot of where we're at, especially in the charismatic world. I always tell charismatics, you need a couple of really good reformed buddies. You really do. And I have that. I have really good reformed buddies that I'm always pushing and challenging them, and they appreciate it, and they're doing the same with me. We got to have that, because it's not way over here, no spirit, and way over here where everything's spirit. It's that good balance of in between. And the only way to get there is for us to think critically and to not be afraid to voice criticism. We have this culture in the church that if you voice criticism, whether it's prophetic words or, heaven forbid, the man of God, then you're somehow gossiping, you're slandering, lack of faith. That's got to go. That is a predator or an abuser's, that's his heyday. Is for any kind of, and that's why Dr. Brown took such a hit, and he couldn't see why he was getting hit so hard when he came and told people to basically not engage on social media. They took it as that. They took it as a rebuke to not criticize. And yeah, we have to have it. If anything taught us in these last 4 years politically in the church, as all of the things that were being exposed in culture and politics, we would tell our church every weekend, guys, we need healthy skepticism right now. And boy, do we need that in the church. And we have to give room for it. We can't correct people when even if they have a bit of a bad spirit on them. Because if they're younger and immature, they might have a bad spirit. But a lot of people, they won't. But we need to actually encourage the right, healthy skepticism when it comes to whether leaders or prophetic words. Leaders like on this, I naively believed that Mike, and Jack Deere told me this when we talked soon after, the whole Bickle exposure stuff. Jack Deere's first thing he said to me, he said, man, I would have never thought that, he goes, if I would have thought if there was a human being on earth that would have not had any kind of sexual immorality, it would have been Mike Bickle. And I would have been right there with him. Yet at the same time, looking back, you always, see things more clearer. There were definitely things that Mike did that I would never say were immorally shady, but boundaries shady for sure. Proximity, there were things that were like off, but it was Mike. And so you wouldn't dare question that. And I thought, you know what? I'm not going to do that anymore. And I'm going to teach younger people, the pastors and disciples that I'm raising up, to not do that, to question things. It's okay to say, hey, why do you do it like that? Why do you have the locks on your door like that in your office? Why do you have that proximity, with that coworker who is an opposite sex of you? And there just seems to be a whole lot of private interaction. How is that okay? We need more of that. I know I kind of went everywhere on that, but man, it's at the end of the day, healthy criticism. We need it. We need a good dose of it in the church.
Do you? This is sort of a rehash of kind of the previous question, but it's one thing to take a principle and be like, all right, I want that in the church. You're as a local pastor, do you have ways of sort of inculcating that into the culture of your church when it comes to the practice of spiritual gifts?
As far as criticism.
Yeah, a healthy criticism, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think we could always be better at it. I think we have to be careful. Like I look back, we brought Chris Reed in here, which was a very new gate for our weekend church, right? Our weekend church service, putting Chris Reed, preaching not being fine, and then he ministered prophetically from the stage after the service. That was a huge new gate for our weekend congregation. Because again, our weekends, our weekends are very big, open door, evangelistic, and I mean, we're teaching everything, but as far as an expression of something like that, which is very new to a lot of people, because we're such a hybrid church here as far as all kinds of different backgrounds, church backgrounds. I wish I would have, like as he was ministering, I wish I would have just helped people to say, hey, it's okay not to take this as gospel. It's okay to not receive this as absolute truth. He may say a few things and have a few things that are accurate to help you understand that, because, he would always try to give, words where describing who you are, and that kind of builds your faith a little bit, right? Like, oh man, okay, he had this information, so maybe he really is hearing from God. I just wish I would have said, hey, it's okay to be critical of that. It's okay to not fully believe that everything he's saying is absolutely from God. And I think just little statements like that, whether they're from the platform at a church service or even in small groups as we're ministering prophetically, giving room for people to be critical. I think it's really that simple. And at the same time, because you're going to have some that are going to be, especially if they're from a Reformed background or just in their personality, more critical in nature, helping them to not be so critical and to actually have an open mind. We got to do both. But, outside of that, I don't want to.
It's within the.
Yeah,
it's within the teaching rather than a systemic sort of change.
Yeah, but I think that, right, in our swirls, that's going to be different from churches and how they practice or not practice, gifts and stuff like that. But for here, that's going to be something that we did. We can quickly curb and just create a culture, which I think we're going to do, period. Like, we have a lot of guests that come in here. And, and I don't know how you do this, but guests, that, again, it's a guest. We don't know them. We know their messaging, and we're going to vouch for their messaging. Like, even with a lot of stuff with what Bickle, Bickle, ministered here at Grace many, many times I've been here for 10 years, over the last 10 years, once a year. And so there's things that he would say messaging wise that I would still stand behind because I can prove it. I can test it with the scriptures. Right. Other things, prophetic experiences, etc., maybe not. I think we need to test it. And I think we need to just create a culture to where it's okay to be critical. So that's a tough one.
Well, and it's something that I'm grateful for with my own personal history with the prophetic and learning at Wellspring under Jack, that they encouraged was the judgment of prophecy. So it was something that was, especially if you're new to the prophetic and there's words of knowledge, if somebody gets an accurate word of knowledge, there can be this default setting of I trust everything that comes after it. And it takes a degree of maturity to kind of filter through and pray through it and say, you know what, I agree with this, I don't agree with that. And that can be challenging for people.
I agree.
I'm curious. So one of the things that I really appreciated was there was a podcast with Alan Hood where he was talking about things that he identified in the culture that he experienced at IHOP that was conducive to burnout and not necessarily seeing all the things that were happening behind the scenes. It's something that I found very helpful in addressing here locally with some other ministries that have foundations of coming from IHOP, of acknowledging the places where there was I'll just call it an overemphasis on spiritual pursuits at the expense of what I would call relational wisdom, and how to protect your own energy, making sure that your relationships are prioritized, family is first, things like that. What is your current disposition towards the prayer movement? As somebody, I think we all love the prayer movement. We all love the Lord and love prayer. After this experience, how are you viewing things and processing through your experience with the prayer movement?
Couple of things. Number one, Mike spent a lot of time trying to justify 24/7 biblically. And I think, if I'm going to be honest, looking back, I think there's some passages massaged to try to come to that conclusion. Which, I don't know, there's probably 10 reasons of why he wanted to do that. Because my point is, if you want to pray, don't try to massage biblical passages to justify something. Now, of course, he had a whole financial model going behind it, and, the whole, musicians and singers and 24/7 and intercessory missionaries, all of these things that he was trying to justify to give people the right to go and raise support for, to get people to give money towards. So I get that, what he was doing. And I taught it, preached it, believed it. Looking back now with a little bit more of I always tell people, I was in my late 20s when I went to IHOP and just took everything as gospel, prophetic history, the theology of night and day prayer. I'm 47 now. I wish I was 47 when I went. and looking back, I understand now why no one was 47. Everybody almost was in their 20s and early 30s. I think that was very intentional from Mike. So, yeah, I don't agree with a lot of the theology to support 24/7. I think it's okay. I think if IHOP wants to do it, they still are, then great, do it. I just don't know if we're going to go to lengths on trying to justify it biblically. That bothers me.
Because Jesus is going to come back.
Yeah, right. Yeah. That whole point. Yeah, I'm thinking, man, dude, there's some serious stretches here. And then there's one other thing I was going to talk about. Because what did you ask again? You asked on the theology of 90-day prayer, burnout. Oh, man. The burnout wasn't so much, the burnout, some was the commitment to the prayer room. That was some. In my experience, that wasn't the big thing. It was the non-stop hype. Mike lived in a world where there was earth-shattering events, prophetic words, new relationships, this connection, that connection, and it was always at a level 10. There were 3 or 4 of those every couple months, and I couldn't handle it anymore. The hyper spiritual, just that hyper charismatic. Because when I say hyper charismatic, that's what I think of. Some people think of like a church service hanging off the chandeliers. We didn't have any of that. The expression of IHOP was actually very tamed as it relates to charismatic expressions in a service. Very tamed. There was only a handful of times of prophetic words given in that kind of sense. I'm sure it's more than a handful, but you get my gist. It wasn't our normal day in and day out, week in and week out experience. It was the extracurricular, hyper spiritual things happening. And it caused disillusionment because Mike would use those stories to keep you hooked into, if I leave here, I will miss out. And man, I finally got to the point about the 10-year, 11-year mark where if I heard another story, I was just going to vomit. I was growing resentment in my heart towards them. And it caused burnout. And there's a lot of people that can relate to that. I hear actually more of that than I do the demand of the 24/7 prayer room.
Do you think that there is any percentage of the prophetic history that is true?
A
And if so,
very small percent, very small. In my opinion, today, I think it was mostly fabricated. I think that you could have, in other words, here's what I say when I say mostly. All of us can relate to this. You can have an experience, and then over time, that experience just gets bigger. And so there was a part of that experience that was legit. Like God really did speak on that night, and I really did cry. And then 10 years later, that has grown. And oh my gosh, I didn't realize that this was happening. And I didn't realize that this was connected to this. And yeah, so I think most of the prophetic history was fabricated or greatly embellished. And I think there was some of it because I do think that Bob and Paul and like people like Chris Reed, I think there really is some kind of gifting that's going on there. Something. I think some of it's undeniable. There's some kind of gifting, if you want to call it that, spiritual activity, something where they're tapping into information that is, I hope, mostly from God. I hope. I used to say all from God, and now I'm like, I hope it was mostly from God. So I can't deny that. I mean, there was clearly things that were undeniable. You know, Sam Storms is writing right now. I don't know when he's going to release this or if he ever will. I know he's working on it to where he's really, really, really going back and scrutinizing a lot of the prophetic history. And in light of what we know now as Mike as a, sociopathic liar, how can you not go back and say, okay, if he lied about this, then what else did he lie about?
Right.
I think we'd be dumb not to.
Well, and one of the things that we can also miss in the prophetic, aside from judging the prophetic, is how it can be used in an abusive way.
Yeah.
And even the legitimate. So this is a current example that I have is a friend had prophetic words about what to look for in his wife. Fine. Take it way before the Lord. He's a single guy. Then he enters into a new relationship and immediately shares those words with the girl that he is dating on day one, and puts all this pressure on her because she matches a handful of the criteria of you must be my spouse. So
take notes, fellas. This is how it's done.
Somebody smack this guy. That's what needs to happen. He needs the rod of discipline in his life. My God.
So it doesn't actually mean that the prophetic words were wrong, but how they were applied and what somebody did with them was an abusive approach to prophecy, because it's saying, God said this, therefore you need to commit to me. I would say that the way that the prophetic history at IHOP was applied was in a similar fashion. It doesn't necessarily discount every prophetic revelation, but the way that we respond to prophetic words matter, I would say, more than the initial word themselves. And another thing that we can miss is a person with a prophetic word doesn't have more authority over your life than you do. So what you were mentioning about coaching your congregation when it comes to the prophetic, it gives them permission to actually make decisions based on information.
That's right.
And I feel like there's, and I'm curious how your approach is with the church now. There's a sense when it comes to the charismatic world, we'll just say, that has such an appreciation for the revelatory word of the Lord that we tend to discount logic and decision making.
100%.
And I think that has a place in the prophetic or charismatic, or call it whatever, apostolic expression, whatever thing it is. You need to be able to have logic and apply that logic.
Yes.
And, like you're mentioning, things that you saw with Bickle over time. It was logical red flags, but there was a default trust. Um,
100%. Yep.
so how do you, I guess I'm curious what your thoughts or approaches on for I think you mentioned it kind of with bringing in having reformed friends, having people that challenge you. How can you
Yeah.
kind of cultivate that as a culture?
Yeah. I mean, in my opinion, the hyper charismatic world of God, you know, just that first of all, that's not my background. So I grew up in a Baptist world.
Mm-hmm.
And so my whole life was more Baptist. And then when I got born again, it was kind of a Baptist Costal experience. The church I was at was Baptist, yet had some Pentecostalism, had some, all kinds of charismatic stuff in it. And so I that was my default. That was how I was discipled and mentored, was in that world where it was very common. If we erred, we were probably erring on too much criticism, not enough.
Hmm.
And I always tell people, even to this day, here I am all these years later, and even through my time at IHOP, um, my default is I probably operate in the natural too much. Yeah, I probably need to have a dose of, you know, realizing the spiritual implications of things more than I do, because that's my default. That's more of my, the way I was raised, my personality, whatever it would be. That's kind of where I'm at. But you really do. You need that both. You got to have, if God is speaking to you. So, because what I would say to the young guy about, him having these words about his future wife, I would probably challenge them right off the bat and say, I doubt that he did. I don't, you maybe had some feelings or some impressions or some natural desires that you like, red hair and blue eyes or whatever it is. But to say that God spoke that to you, I'm going to say probably not. And we need people like that in our life. We need people, because here's what the hyper charismatic world does with that kind of person. There's no boundaries. There's no challenging. It's just like, oh my gosh, okay, wow, okay, cool. Though, and you just feed it. There's nobody in your face saying that's dumb. No, it's not. And we need that. And then over here, when we get too far into the, you know, everything's in the natural, and God is not given any permission to speak and interrupt your perfectly ordered natural life. You need people in your life to challenge you to hear from God. What's God saying to you right now? Well, here's what I was reading the other day in First John. Okay, great. What's He speaking to you from? What's the Lord saying to your family? What's the Lord saying about the people? And there's no room for that because you're not exercising that. You're not even giving room for God to speak to you. We need that as well. So if we could somehow have both, and when you build a team, like, if I was going to tell people when they're building, not necessarily friends, because friends is different, but if you're going to build a team to do ministry with, you want both of those kinds in your world. And so for me as a pastor, I have really good friends that I wouldn't necessarily say I do life with, but I mean, me meaning not on my staff, people that are just friendships. And one of my dearest friends is, a huge SBC guy that works in NAM, and we interact all the time. And he's challenged by, you know, the things I was just saying on this regard. And then, he's challenging me on his perspective of, you know, not being so spiritual, that everything is spiritual and there's no room at all for just my natural agency of life. So anyways, I think if we're intentional, not dismissing people so quickly because they don't believe like we do, and we put them in a nice little box of a cessationist or whatever, then we can do it. But we got to be willing to have hard conversations, receive hard conversations, and just engage that, celebrate that, compared to only living in an echo chamber where everybody thinks and believes and acts just like you do. It's really not helpful.
I have, for time's sake, I'm sort of cheating here. I'm going to ask sort of a compound question.
Fire away.
I'm wondering what, in the wake of this, what has your relationship has your relationship to prayer changed?
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah, because I was going to
that's
say that
number
earlier when
one.
you asked about that. Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah. Number one. And then number two is how have you been able to uh, keep your heart from getting calloused and jaded and cynical?
Right.
Have you been able to be tender towards the Lord in the middle of this? And if so, how are you doing it? Because I need some tips for a friend, not for me, of course.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because I was going to answer that earlier when Jeff asked about the whole prayer movement, theology, 90-day prayer. One of the things that not just related to prayer, but anything, I picked up so many phrases from Mike through the years. I sat under him directly for 12 years, but then fed from him for 20. So there's so many phrases that you pick up, right? Not so much now because it's, we're over a year later, but man, in those first 3 or 4 months last year after this whole thing blew up, I mean, I would hear things come out of my mouth, whether while I was preaching or praying, and it really messed with me. And so I just began to be intentional of my language, saying the same thing, just saying it different, just semantics, just changing words. And I've done that over time, both with preaching and with prayer. A lot of the things that Mike taught us in prayer was really just praying the biblical prayers. I mean, Mike was a champion at that. And I'm not gonna leave that. I still believe it's biblical to worship and pray, and I believe it's biblical to have worship and prayer together. I can see that in the Bible, and I think in the natural, it just makes prayer more enjoyable. and those were things that Mike would say forever. Just do prayer with worship. Biblical prayers with worship from a grid of intimacy, from a grid that God enjoys hearing us. I think those are all really good principles that I do not want to throw out. Little bitty words and phrases, whether it's in prayer or preaching, yes, I'm adjusting those things. So I think that answers the question on that. Was that kind of what you were asking, right?
Yeah, I was actually sort of asking more about that kind of does, but I was asking more about your personal relationship to prayer. Has your prayer life actually changed in the wake of
No,
this?
not so much. I not so much. I mean, I think types of prayers I'm praying, when it comes to discernment and wisdom and which leads into the second part as far as my heart, resentment. I experienced sadness and shock for a second, and I kind of went right into anger. I went right into just mad and angry, and for all kinds of different reasons, and from anywhere from Mike personally, and the lies, and then the spin from the ELT, from Eric Volz, and the dismissiveness. Misty trying to say that we're conspiring to take down. I mean, they literally believe. I don't know who they are, but there's many that believe that we rented an Airbnb in South Kansas City in the months leading up to what we did and plotted this plan. I still think that Isaac and a few of them believed that we knew we were going to put out our statement a few days later when Dwayne and Brian and I put out our statement. They believed that we calculated that. And I've talked to them, and I'm like, guys, we thought about that 2 seconds before we did it because you guys so, drastically dropped the ball. We had to say something. But my heart gets angry, and I get resentful. Then other leaders not saying anything, people being passive, people being dismissive, people still trying to spin. Yeah, man, my prayer is, God, I want to be a man of justice, and I want to be able to do that and have that shepherd in me that wants to warn people of wolves and to take out wolves. I want to do that. I just want to do it in a way that's godly. I don't want to get in the flesh and curse people out. I don't want to get in the flesh physically, and I don't want to do that. And not that I've got close to it. Maybe my language hasn't been the prettiest. Sometimes privately, I haven't done anything publicly, but just privately. And then I'm like, God, I don't want to do that. I don't want to fuel any kind of, the Sermon on the Mount teaches us, what to do with anger. And I don't want to fuel it. And so I've had to be careful. And I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I don't want to say there's no room for the prophetic. There's no room for these messages that Dr. Brown has or that Mike had, or even Robert Morris. I mean, I thought Robert Morris was a really, really good communicator. Didn't agree with all of his theology, but a good communicator. And I don't want to be one of those guys that just does cancel culture and just cancels everything.
Right.
I want to be able to, still have critical judgment and have a voice that calls out nonsense and still be somebody that is slow to judge, that we judge with wisdom. I think we should do that. I'm trying to do that right now with this whole Daystar thing. I don't know them people at all. I've read some things and I've heard some things, but still, I'm going to be slower to throw my opinion in the ring just because that's what everybody's doing. I don't want to do that. Being slow to judge is still a wise thing to do. Evaluating fruit and taking time, and that's still a wise thing to do. So I'm trying to manage all of that in my heart.
So with Dr. Brown, this is something I've wrestled with. You're a pastor. I'm a pastor. He's in ministry. The reality is, with a lot of these sort of loose, sort of just affiliations, there is no sort of guy who can sit you down. It's supposed
Right.
to be your board, but when your board is writing these letters attacking the accused, calling this partnering, attacking Julie Roy's for partnering with the accuser of the brethren.
Yeah.
It's like, it doesn't seem. I guess here's my question. With somebody in Dr. Brown's situation, what do you think is how can Dr. Brown make things right if he had the desire to do that, and he could, is there a path that he could return to fruitful ministry, or is there, in your position, or in your opinion, would he be like, no, you know what, I'm gonna just sit this out and try to be a faithful member of a church, or what, uh, or do you not even know?
I mean, I think it's a case-by-case scenario as it relates to the question, because there's several things there that we can address. The first thing is, let's just talk about the whole restoration to ministry, right? I think it's a case-by-case scenario. I don't think we can make a blanket statement. But I do think we need to evaluate case by case. And I would love for there to be some kind of universal agreement on a case by case scenario of judgment where, hey, you're done. No, you're done, period. That'd be amazing. I think some of these third-party investigative reports, I think Tikkun is going to really do their best. I think that's their goal. The third-party investigation with Bickle and IHOP, the report's going to be given. They're putting together a group of people from all walks of life that will, in other words, try to craft a statement of judgment. And it would be awesome for the body of Christ to receive that statement and to say, we agree. Now, you're not going to get everybody to, I don't think Bickle is going to agree to it and some of his people in his corner. But if we could get a big amount of people, that's a state, that's huge. And I think that's doable. I don't think it's easy, but I think it's doable. And so I would think in Dr. Brown's case, it seems like that's going to be the direction they're going, where they're really going to get a third-party guidepost type. Then we look at all the facts. It's submitted to a group that is beyond just his board. His board may be involved in it, but it's beyond them. And then when the facts are on the table, a statement is made about that. The truth, of course, of what happened, but also the truth of, hey, this is what we think should happen to his future, whether it's a restoration or not. So I think that a scenario like that is doable, and I think it's needed. Now, Dr. Brown and others kind of having this parachurch approach where there's no local body that they're really doing life with. That's troublesome. That's troublesome. And when we interact with people, one of the things I've learned over the last year, just as me as a shepherd over our flock here, when we are interacting with people, and if we're going to platform somebody that doesn't have that, that's gonna change the whether or not we platform you or not. That is a factor. And then it's also a factor on our relationship with you. Because if you're not, I'm going to be asking why not? And who are they? Who's speaking into your life? Who's challenging you? Because that's not okay. So just on a personal, not that I have authority to make you do it, but if we're interacting to the point to where I appreciate your messaging, I love what you're doing, but I've realized you're not submitted to a body. I want to be a good shepherd and a good friend to say, hey, that's not good. This has been proven to not be a healthy expression of Christianity, and you need to. And then, of course, the power I do have is I can withhold you from being on our platform, which I think is a good thing. So I think we need it. I think that this has gotten out of control, and I think the church needs to reel that in, some of that, no accountability, kind of off on their own, doing their own thing.
Well, and hopefully that's the direction, and that's where I believe that we're going, is to a more healthy place, to where it's not just.
I hope so. I believe. I agree.
Something that you mentioned earlier, even of something the Lord was talking to me about this morning, when Jesus rebukes the Pharisees, where he says, you give your tithes, you do this well, but you've neglected justice and the love of the Lord. It stood out to me that Jesus rebuked him first for neglecting justice, more so than first, prior to even saying you've neglected loving the Lord. He said you've neglected justice. So and that's something that I feel like we're starting to see come back, as this desire for justice in the body. They want to see things that are handled well, where people that are hurt are we lead them to healing, and we're not trying to cover things up just because of big names or big ministries and things of that nature.
Right. I agree. I just hope we don't swing so far that we don't take out critical judgment, because bringing accusation forward needs critical judgment. We still have to weigh that and judge that. We don't just believe any, especially if it's just some random person off the street. We don't know you. You're going to bring these accusations against an elder. We have to judge them. We have to critically, we have to do that too. And so I hope we don't get so swung over to where we've done this so bad, or we've just not believed victims, that we all of a sudden now believe everything with no critical judgment. We can't do that either. We can do both, and we have to resist the mob on both sides as we do it. That's because leadership is hard, and that's okay. We need courageous leaders to not be able to be swayed by either voice demanding that we do it like this. So I agree with you. We need both.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Well, Wes, is there anything else on your heart? Would you be willing to pray for the audience, or share any last bits of advice and things that you're just fresh stirring in your heart?
Yeah, I think this is a new gate. I think there's always been scandal in the church. I think we're in a day where, social media, communication, information can be given lights out clear. So it's a new day. It's a new day for the church to try to figure out, how do we now navigate these things being exposed? And then the way that we've handled the exposure is also being exposed. And so I think in a little bit of time, we're going to figure it out. And I think there are some exaggerations right now and some things that we aren't doing well, even in responding to scandal and exposing it. But I think it'll balance out. I think it'll be okay. My advice right now is, let's be slow to speak and be willing to lean in and listen and hear these criticisms and these those quote unquote scandals that are being exposed, because a lot of people don't like Julie Royce. And so they're just going to put their fingers in their ear and they're not even going to hear it because they don't like the messenger. And I'm like, guys, if you have any sense at all to see what the Lord is doing right now, yeah, maybe you disagree with her practices. Maybe you disagree with her ethics of the way she's doing it. But to just completely dismiss any of the criticism that she's bringing to the table, holy cow, you are living with your head in the sand, man. Right. So anyways, I believe that in due time, we're going to figure it out. It's going to be right, healthy, and godly. So let me just pray for us. Father, we just come, Lord, very sober, very aware that we are in times that are troublesome. They're troubling. We're a bit vulnerable right now. We feel a bit exposed. And a lot of things have been shaken, and that's okay. God, help us to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Help us to not lose faith in everything. Help us to grow in this. How can we grow in discernment and wisdom and love and judgment? Help us to grow in all of the things that you're giving us an opportunity to grow in a time when everything not everything, but a lot of things are being shaken. Help us to see the good in it. And we ask you for that fruit that you are intending to grow, that it would grow in really powerful and strong ways. God, give us, we just ask you for the hand of God in our midst, for the power of the Holy Spirit, for a love of the Bible to increase. God, we bless you and we love you in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Wes, thanks for being with us.
Man, my pleasure, man. Really, really enjoyed being with you guys, and just hope the best for all the future episodes that you guys do.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to interview Eric Volz next, so
that would be amazing. I wish he would. I wish he would go on to some Friendly Fire, and because I think he'd do great. I think that, of course, the guy is a really, he's good at what he does. But I'd love for some super constructive, challenging questions. And you're not going to agree on everything, but yeah, man, interesting times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
JonMark, did you have any other questions?
Yes, I have a question for everybody watching this at this point. Why aren't you subscribed already? Like, it's just a little button. You just push it, and it really helps us out. You'd be doing me a solid. You'd be doing Jeff a solid. So please subscribe, like, share this if you found it informative. Wes, is there how can people follow you? Do you want people to follow you?
I got off Twitter years ago, and then I ended up, after this all went out, because Twitter or X was such a platform people were interacting, I opened up another account, but I just, I don't really use it for any other purposes beyond gathering information and interacting with a handful of people I know. Our church here, we're a local body here in St. Louis, really, really focused here locally. GraceSTL.org is our website. But yeah, that's it. Just our teaching and ministry and trying to bless this little part of earth here in St. Louis, because man, we need it.